The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle believed that every practice or activity aims at some good. It aims to bring about some state of affairs that the practitioner wants or perhaps should want. I'm a teacher. I want my students to learn. The nurse wants the sick patient to get better. The legislator wants to make laws in the public interest. These are all aims that are intrinsic to the activity. Aristotle believed that the practitioner who was able to achieve these aims would often need what he called virtues or excellences. These could be things like patience or courage, the ability to deliberate with others, good judgment, discernment or understanding, empathy, the ability to take another person's perspective. And the practitioner who acquired these traits of character would be more likely to know what was the right thing to do in a particular situation, to do it in the right way and at the right time and for the right reason. And this he called phronesis, or practical wisdom. Nowadays, talk of wisdom and virtue and character sounds sort of quaintly old-fashioned. We tend to assume that if we have good rules and the right incentives, people will perform their functions in the best possible manner. Now, Aristotle agreed that rules are important, but he believed that they were not sufficient. You need practically wise individuals to know how to interpret and to apply the rules. And sometimes the rules need to be bent, or institutions need to be changed in order to attain the goals that are intrinsic to them. I'm going to give you a couple of examples today of wise practitioners, people who have appreciated the intrinsic value of the activity that they have undertaken and have been able to create opportunities or spaces for the cultivation of wise decision making. But before I talk about them, I'd like to first give you an example of what can happen when an organization does not encourage wise decision making. I want to take you back to the evening of July the 5th, 2013. A train engineer parked a train that was a mile long, carrying more than 70 cars, most of them filled with heavy crude oil, on a declining grade, pointing down toward the town of Lac-Mégantic in Quebec, about 10 kilometers away. The engineer secured the train with 7 handbrakes, but neglected to turn off the independent air brakes to make sure that these handbrakes were sufficient to hold the train in place. And he had worked that train pretty hard to get to the top of the hill, and he noticed that the main engine was spewing a dark and oily smoke. So he called the rail traffic controller, and he reported the problem. And they decided that a crew would come in the next morning and have a look at the engine and decide what to do. So he got a cab to his hotel, and he left the train unattended. Shortly afterward, the train caught fire. A call to 911 brought firefighters to the scene, and they, following protocol and in consultation with the track foreman, turned off the engine to stop the fuel going to the fire, thereby extinguishing the fire. But they didn't realize that by turning off the engine, they cut power also to the independent air brakes. Once again, they left the scene and the train was left unattended. And gradually, the pressure in the air brakes dropped. And as it did, the train began to move. And it gathered speed, and by the time it hit the town of Lac-Mégantic, it was going 100 kilometers an hour. It came to a curve in the rails and derailed, spewing 6 million liters of heavy crude oil into the center of the town, leaving the town look like it had been hit by a bomb. 47 people died. Now, how could such a terrible accident happen? You know, if we were to imagine ourselves as omniscient spectators watching the events unfold, I think what we would see is that nobody grasped the full meaning of the situation. Nobody saw that this train was like a missile pointed at the heart of a small town. Everybody was doing their jobs more or less competently, but they were operating inside different boxes. And if we open up some of these boxes, we find some interesting results. If we look at what was going on within the company, for example, it turns out the company did not have a good safety culture. The CEO was more interested in profits than in training his employees to be concerned with safety. The company cut corners, literally, routing explosive cargo through heavily populated areas. They parked trains on main lines rather than on sidings, and they used substandard parts for replacements in the maintenance of their machines, and that is in fact what had started the fire in the first place. If we stand back and look at another box, the role of government, we find that regulators had cut the number of inspectors drastically in the preceding 5 years, even as the number of trains carrying heavy crude oil increased by 500%. Now, we can imagine how things could have worked out differently. We could imagine wise decisions that could have averted this disaster. Had the engineer checked to see whether the handbrakes alone would hold the train? Had the train been parked in a siding, not in a on the main rail? Had the company cared more about its safety record? Had government regulators been enforcing regulations? Wise decisions could have prevented this terrible catastrophe. So I want to give you some examples now of a couple of wise practitioners, people who have understood the intrinsic aim of the practice they're involved in and have created spaces for the cultivation of practical wisdom. The first example I want to give you is Liz Evans. Liz Evans was a psychiatric nurse working in an emergency ward in a Vancouver hospital. She'd go to work in the morning, and they do the grand rounds with doctors, nurses, and orderlies, and they talk about the patients. She'd talk about how she would spend hours listening to, talking to her patients, trying to understand their problems. And her colleagues would look at her as if she was sort of wasting her time. So Liz Evans realized that hospitals are great for dealing with acute crises, but they bring people in and put them in boxes, deal with them at a moment in time, address their symptoms, and then discharge them. They don't look at the person in the box and understand that this is someone who has a history. As Liz Evans found, many of her patients were dealing with terrible sadness and pain. 2/3 of the people in her ward were homeless and poor. And the hospital would treat their symptoms and release them, discharge them back into the population, and maybe they'd come back in a month presenting the same symptoms. Or maybe they wouldn't come back at all because they'd perished in the streets. Liz Evans decided to make a change. She began to work with a non-governmental organization that wanted to create a space in the Vancouver downtown east side, a place where people could come indoors, people who had fallen off the map, folks dealing with problems of addiction, homelessness, mental illness. What she didn't realize was that this was the beginning of a major epidemic. At this time, 400 people in British Columbia were dying every year of overdoses. That's more than one person every day, many of them in the downtown east side. The rate of HIV infection was the highest in North America and comparable to levels in sub-Saharan Africa, and this was largely due to needle sharing. So Liz Evans realized that she was going to have to work with other nurses and with nuns and doctors and academics and lawyers and community activists and addicts' families to try to create a new alternative way of dealing with the problem. And so they created what's known as Insight, a place where you can go and get clean needles, where you can shoot up in relative safety. You can shoot up where, if there's a crisis, there are people on hand to help you, and if people want to go into detox, that opportunity is also available. Insight has had a major impact. It's reduced the number of overdoses, it's substantially diminished the rate of HIV infection, and it's extended the life expectancy of people living in the downtown east side. To create an organization like that and to run it requires some of the virtues that Aristotle talked about: empathy, compassion, patience, courage. It also took the motivation that comes from understanding that the role of the nurse is to prevent harm and to enable individuals and communities to flourish. The second example I want to give you comes from politics, and it may be that it's in politics where practical wisdom is most needed and most difficult to attain. Preston Manning was the leader of the Reform Party. when he went to Ottawa in the 1990s. And he believed that there were a lot of problems with Canadian democracy, that Parliament was dysfunctional. Ordinary members of Parliament didn't have enough influence. There was too much party discipline, too much partisanship, not enough free votes. Committees weren't working well. Question period was a circus. And so he proposed a wide range of reforms, including perhaps most notably reforms to the Senate, to create a Senate that would be elected. He also tried to diminish partisanship in the House of Commons. So for example, before question period, he would actually call up ministers and tell them the questions that he was going to put to them so that they would provide a more thoughtful answer. Well, it turned out that the media wasn't particularly interested in covering that kind of thoughtful exchange of ideas. And instead focused on the antics of members of Parliament who would attack each other and behave outlandishly. And so the practice fell into disuse. Preston Manning wound up leaving politics feeling that changing democratic institutions from the inside was really hard and really slow. So perhaps an alternative solution would be to change the practitioners, to change the people before they go into these institutions. And so he came to UBC, to the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, and proposed that we create a school for politicians. And we thought, what a great idea. If you want to be a doctor, a lawyer, a nurse, a teacher, a firefighter, a train engineer, an entrepreneur, or a soldier, we have schools for all of those things. Why don't we have a school for politicians? Politicians manage the biggest budgets in our economy. They run the largest and most complex organizations that we have, and they make the laws and the regulations that govern every minute detail of our lives. And yet, politics is dominated by amateurs. There's nowhere where you can go to learn how to be a good politician. And so we've created a program. It's still a pilot. It's called Summer Institutes for Future Legislators, where we invite people who aspire to enter politics to come to learn the skill and know-how you need to be an effective politician, to rub shoulders with and be mentored by inspiring and experienced practitioners. And we hope that through this, people will learn what it means to be a legislator, what it means to represent people, how you serve your constituents. We've had some initial success. One of our graduates, Heather Sweet, was elected to the Alberta legislature in the last provincial election. She said that the experience of meeting inspiring practitioners and thinking about the practice of politics was helpful as she entered the political arena. I began with the tragic story of Lac Megantic. I think it's a metaphor for many of the runaway problems that we encounter in our society. Runaway epidemics, runaway climate change, runaway inequality. We need practical wisdom now more than ever before, because we're not going to improve the quality of our democracy by following rules and responding to incentives any more than we can address runaway climate change by following rules and responding to incentives. And we would not have gotten insight unless people were prepared to challenge the rules. And instead of following incentives to focus on the aims that were intrinsic to the practice, we need wise practitioners like that. We need practical wisdom in our lives, in our friendships, in our families, in our workplaces, in our leisure time, and in our politics. You know, practical wisdom is something that comes naturally to us, but it needs to be cultivated. Aristotle understood that the pursuit of the good is an essential part of what it means to live a fully human life and to thrive as individuals in community.